So welcome back, everybody, if you were with us last time, and welcome to session 2. So we're going to talk today about whether the menopause indeed is just is a hot topic that we should be taking seriously, or is it just the latest fad that happens to be hitting the headlines. Now, actually, I want to come at it today in terms of one of my other big passions, aside from the menopause, and talk about why silence is the silent killer in business success. So it's a little bit why it's my passion behind being the midlife mistress. So it's been going out and talking about things that are taboo and, shattering those silences that is really the motivator behind what I do. And obviously in this particular instance, talking about the menopause is exactly that. So to show that I practice what I preach, just to share with you, I did my first ever LinkedIn Live last week, talking about both midlife and menopause as part of that. And, it's important for me to, like I said, to do what I say to others to do. And actually, I can share with you that I said the word vagina 4 times on LinkedIn last week, which I'm particularly proud of on a professional platform. So out in the LinkedIn ether somewhere will be me saying words that most of us feel uncomfortable with. And I can't say I felt 100% comfortable, but it was essential to the subject matter. Now, the reason that I have a thing about silence and things that we don't speak up about in the workplace or in life in general, but obviously particularly at work, is that, like I said, I think silence is a killer. It's a killer in terms of how individuals feel. Silence affects teams and team dynamics, and ultimately that affects businesses because it dims the lights of individuals when they can't speak up about the things that matter to them or the things that are happening to them or the experiences they're having. And that, in this instance, particularly in the workplace, I think it then snuffs out passion for what people do. So people are less productive when they feel that they can't come to work and authentically be themselves. And I think ultimately that erodes cultures. And when we don't speak up about things, then it makes us complicit. It makes us complicit in the status quo, or if something new and different is happening and we know that that new and different isn't right, if we say nothing, then we are complicit in whatever is going on. And I feel passionately about this because when I was being bullied in a large corporate environment, one in particular, it was actually the lack of others that were prepared to speak up that made it worse. Not least when, and I'd like to describe it, that I was the only bird on the board in that particular environment. And I would go into meetings and I would be bullied in that meeting by the most senior person in the room, and very openly so. And it was the silence of the others around the table. Now, some of those people sometimes joined in, but actually it was the silence of the others that was more noticeable, and not least because outside of that meeting, on one occasion in particular, somebody came to check that I was okay, having watched me be treated like this and having said nothing, and said, because that was a little bit like bullying. And I said, that wasn't like bullying, that was bullying. And I said, and what was most noticeable is that not you or anyone else spoke up and stepped in and spoke up on my behalf, when you know that that behavior is wrong and you all come to me privately and complain about that very behavior, but you weren't prepared to say anything when you saw it happening. So I get very passionate about not staying silent, because when we think about it, the majority of us in whatever walk of life, so whether we see it in a corporate setting and we operate in a team, whether we see it in the world in general, we are all, pretty much every single one of us, regardless of what you do in life, every single one of us are followers in some way, shape or form. Even when we might also be leaders, ultimately we're usually following somebody else or something else. And actually, I like to talk a lot about the fact that followers are the voice. They do have the power to make some changes. And that's why, for me, it's important that we talk about taboo subjects. It's important that we shatter the silence, that we speak up against shame. I think menopause is one of those topics where we now need to really start doing it. So I want to talk today about why we shouldn't be silent about the menopause in particular. So let's have a look at some of the sort of facts around menopause at work. Now, I'm not going to go meticulously through every single one of these, but I do think it's really important that we start to understand the magnitude of the problem, because when we understand that there really is an issue that we should be attending to, then that starts to galvanize us and see the importance of talking about it, whether that's within our own organization, or if you're here working with clients and you want to talk to them about it, or you're here on behalf of another workplace or another environment. It's just about saying, where does the passion need to come from about why this is so important? And actually, I think one of the key things is really the point at the top, that, women aged 50 plus, essentially menopausal women, if you take the average age that we talked about last week being 51 as the average age of the menopause, those women in that 50 plus group are the fastest growing workplace demographic. So that is why it's becoming increasingly important for us to talk about it. We can challenge, why haven't we talked about it before? Why does this still remain one of the taboos? And there are lots of reasons around that. But the reason it's becoming so important and so imperative that we now make it a focus of workplaces and making change in the workplace is because those women, that group of followers that we might have in our organization, are the fastest growing demographic. And if, as you read down some of those statistics there, the negative impact on those women at work of the menopause, and actually the fact that 25% of them said that the symptoms they experience are debilitating, and the amount that have then taken time off work, we need to then understand just how impactful this is. And not least when you drop to the last point on the slide, is that actually of the women surveyed, 12% resigned as a direct result of their menopausal symptoms. So we touched on some of this last time we were together, but actually the loss of that talent. And actually, when we get sort of into our 40s and our 50s, that's really when we're reaching the peak of our experience, both in life and the workplace. We usually, we never reach that point where we know everything about what we do, but we've learned an awful lot. As organizations, you've probably invested in the training, the development, the learning that those people have gone through. And then when you're actually looking at the attrition of those women from the workplace, it starts to help you understand why it's just so important that we make this a focus and say, okay, what can we do to stop ourselves from either losing these women from the organization, but actually just, if they are there and they stay there, how do we make the workplace just a better place for them? Because I think what worries me the most is actually the point on there that of those that took time off, and obviously the percentage of those is pretty high, then only 5% had menopausal symptoms listed on their sickness certificate. And for me, that absolutely speaks volumes about the fact that women don't feel able to speak up. So that silence is an issue that those women are grappling with, but also that needs to be a responsibility that organizations should take on, about saying, how do we create an environment when, we can actually talk about the menopause? Now, those negative impacts are huge, as I say, and for anybody that joined us last time, you'll know that my corporate career, I talked about the fact that I had nearly 25 years of corporate life, and during that time, no one came and spoke to me about their menopause. No line manager came to speak to me about the impact of the menopause on members of their team, or anything that they were struggling with that may have led us to understand that menopause was the impact that person was experiencing. But I equally have to hold myself to account, because when I didn't know I was going through my menopause when I was going through it, but subsequently when I knew that I had gone through the menopause, I didn't speak about it either. And it's one of the reasons that I've been through this transition and realized that actually I was also guilty of not speaking up. I was also guilty of hiding it. And that was purely because of shame and embarrassment. I was embarrassed that I was a 30-something-year-old woman who'd been through the menopause, and I just didn't know how to begin to have that conversation, to talk about what had happened to me. And actually by that point, less about the physical impacts, because my menopause was over by that time, but actually the emotional impacts lasted for way, way longer. And I was still dealing with those whilst trying to hold down a demanding and a stressful job. And all it resulted in is making me, physically poorly, because I was holding in all of that angst and that stress and that pressure and that embarrassment, and not having an environment to talk about it. So it's important that we understand, you know, that actually for me, definitely it is a hot topic and not just the latest fad. This is not something that's going to go away. It is absolutely, you know, it's affected women for you know, hundreds of years, and it is going to carry on affecting them into the future. So we do need to step up and do something about it, because it's not an issue that's about to go away. Now, if you're going out and talking either within your organisation or on behalf of your organisation within other businesses and with other clients, it's worth thinking about, you know, there are some legal and reputational reasons why the menopause should be on the agenda. So just to touch on some of those, you know, there isn't actually any direct legal menopause provision. Now, I'm not about to try and teach a law firm and the members of it about the law. That's absolutely not my place to do that. But it is just worth touching on, you know, some of the places where the legal risks obviously do raise themselves. And as you can see from the article that's on the right, that was, you know, literally from a few months ago, that got a lot of coverage. You know, there are women that are going to tribunal that are now starting to you know, bring and win cases where the menopause has been spoken about in a derogatory sense within their workplace. Now, you would hope that most workplaces, you know, it wouldn't get spoken about in this way. But the reality is, you know, we all know, we can probably all point to, possibly all worked in before now, organizations where absolutely this kind of banter, and I think there's probably nothing that puts fear into the heart of an HR or a legal person more than the word banter, because a joke suddenly becomes extremely unfunny when you have to repeat those words in front of an employment tribunal. But there are, you know, elements of legal provision where the menopause, or somebody that is experiencing the menopause, you know, would be covered. So obviously the Equality Act is one of those. There are risks of constructive dismissal. So where somebody feels that the environment that's been created doesn't allow them to work effectively, or it's been made to feel, you know, so uncomfortable for them in relation to either the environment itself or the behaviours, that actually that person feels that they've got no option but to leave that organisation. The Health and Safety at Work Act itself will obviously make sure that we have work environments that are safe and reasonable, that risks, for example, are managed. And there may well be, with some of the symptoms of the menopause, and certainly some of the things we covered last time, you know, remember there are, you know, over 60 different possible symptoms. So it's really important that we do undertake that kind of risk assessment and that process of listening to the individual about what are the symptoms, what are the things that are impacting them. So if there's, you know, memory issues, brain fog, extreme exhaustion, difficulty sleeping, we have to remember that under the Health and Safety at Work Act, we do have to, you know, we have a responsibility as employers to make sure that our employees are safe and well. So we need to think about the impacts of those symptoms. But then when we look beyond that, because, you know, let's face it, you know, not every business that you work within or are working with, you know, are going to respond very well if you sort of talk about the law. I know that from working in HR, from working in big corporates. You know, there will be some people that might sit around the table that are decision makers who, you know, absolutely, you talk to them about the different areas of the law and the implications of that, they will sit up and take notice. There will be other people around that table who are like, yeah, you know, well, it's never happened to us. You know, the number of times somebody said to me, yeah, well, you know, we've never gone to tribunal, so like, we're not really worried about that. Well, actually, it is more of that, the underlying reputational risk, isn't it? That you know, you may not end up on the front of the Daily Mail, like this particular case that we've got up here, but actually you've got other mechanisms. You know, you've got Glassdoor and other, you know, we've got the internet, social media. If the reputation of your business is such that, you know, it's not a welcome place for women, or derogatory remarks get made, or, you know, the things that, you know, your sickness issues or whatever can't be discussed, or, you know, your productivity is poor because you're not have the right environment and the right supportive environment when you're dealing with other issues, and particularly medical issues, that reputation and damage to it will, you know, get out there. So that idea of the damage to employee engagement. And we are, if we listen to the press, we are in the middle of, the Great Resignation, people reconsidering where they want to work, how they want to work, who they want to work for. And, all of that on the back of the pandemic, and the fact that we all sort of had that opportunity, whether we liked it or not, to sort of rethink our lives and what mattered to us. In the midst of a great resignation, the last thing you want to do is, lose your 50-something women who feel that they're not in an environment where they're supported, or not be able to recruit other people, particularly other women, but just other people in general, if the sense that they have is that your environment is not one that is supportive when you have medical issues, and that really it's just reduced to a little bit of, joking and tittering in the background about somebody's issues. So recruitment will be difficult, retention will be hard, and also productivity. Again, going back to the idea of what women report in terms of their experience of the menopause is absolutely that they worry about their productivity, their effectiveness at work gets impacted. So if we don't try and make a better environment for them to make them as productive as possible whilst they're coping with the symptoms of the menopause, if we are too rigid and inflexible in the way in which we do the work, where we do the work, how the outputs get achieved, then ultimately we will create an environment where these women who are dealing with these fluctuations in hormones, different symptoms coming and going, they won't be able to operate effectively. And ultimately that leads to customer perception. We all know that is that if you get a bad reputation, then it takes a long time with your customers to turn that around, despite all your protestations and your statements in terms of, we're doing this and we're, a socially responsible employer. Ultimately, customers will vote with their feet if they don't believe you. So one of the things that then wants to talk about is, how do you then start raising these questions and these topics with your business? And it's, sometimes that's hard. And I think that my best advice is really about trying to think about your audience. Who are you trying to raise this issue with? I always have a phrase that's about like going with the energy. So rather than necessarily, taking it to a team meeting where you might get a very mixed response from people that might initially be embarrassed or shut it down, is absolutely, who's the person that you think would be most receptive to having this conversation? They might not be the most senior person, they might initially not be the decision maker, but actually it's about understanding what energy there is, and that person that you think would be interested in this as a conversation would see it as important within your organization or within your client base. And start there in terms of building that energy, sounding them out, understanding what terminology you need to use, understand with different individuals what approach you might want to take. So is it a case of that they will respond to if you talk about the legal implications because they might be quite risk averse around that? Are they going to be more engaged by the more emotive side of it in terms of how employees feel and how engaged they will be as a result of their experience? So just try and think about that balance and where you might gain some support and some energy before you sort of maybe do the big reveal in a meeting and try and get everybody on board. Because the idea of gaining those followers, it's in itself, when we want to break that silence, when we want to break the taboos, it is about then getting those other followers on board. Because like I said, they are the ones with the power when we have that collective voice. So if you can gain those people who will be supporters and follow them, that's how we can make change. Because ultimately, there is power in that team, that collective view. And once we start making some noise about these subjects, once we start showing how important it is, looking, for example, of how many women do we have in our organization currently? What ages are they? What mechanisms do we have currently that we might actually be able to utilize and bring the menopause into it? I talked last time about, utilizing, mental health first aiders and giving them some menopause training, some menopause specific training, for example. Even with your medical first aid trainers, you might actually want to give them some extra menopause training so that they are able to and equipped to deal with that. So it's not necessarily about also always starting something new and different. It might actually just be about adding something on to something you already do, which from an organizational point of view then makes it an easier step to take and a little less scary. So that leads us really into the next couple of sessions that we'll be doing, because actually the next session that we'll have next week, we'll be talking about talking to men about the menopause. So if you are in a work environment that is very male dominated, or you work with clients where there's a lot of males, but you know that this is a conversation that you might need to have, then it's really important that we start understanding, okay, what are the barriers in terms of men talking about the menopause? So we're going to concentrate on that next time, which then will lead us into ultimately the final session, which will be about, you know, how do you develop a menopause plan for your workplace? What kinds of things could workplaces do in order to start creating an environment that says it's okay to talk about the menopause? We find this, you know, important, and we want to create a safe space. So we'll be talking about how you build a menopause plan. As you'll know, if you were joined us last time, I am the fan of a quote, and I've got a shorter quote today, but it's one for me that is particularly sort of personal and impactful when we talk about the idea of, you know, followers actually having the greater power, and followers having the ability to sort of shatter those silences and tackle those taboos when we choose to not be complicit in silence, but actually to speak up. And it's a quote that I found when I was doing my master's dissertation. It's actually printed at the front of it. And it's one that actually I think is particularly relevant at the time that we're living in. I think it's possibly relevant during the times of COVID, but I think it's particularly relevant at the moment with the situation that's going on between Russia and Ukraine that's impacting us all. So the quote is by Barbara Kellerman, who wrote a fantastic book called Followership, which is all about the power of the follower. And it's as simple as this. And it says, Europe's Jews were massacred by Hitler's followers. So that's Europe's Jews were massacred by Hitler's followers, which says everything about the fact that when we're silent, we are complicit. And when we're silent and complicit, then terrible things can happen. That's me for today. Any questions?